Over and we all go up the grave. You can look around the airfield, but your search will be in vain. For we all will be in London, getting drunk and raising Cain, like the man behind the armor-plated desk. The man behind the armor-plated desk.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the third and last effort of the Crusaders of the Round Table, which has been an attempt which we hope you enjoyed, and I have, and I know many of you, and those who certainly participated, in getting in page 1 and 2, beginning of recapturing the cross-section of history of our life and times in the 392nd. We haven't touched the surface because a lot of the experiences are indelible somewhere in a man's mind, a lady's mind, and they don't come to total recall after all these years. But today, it's my pleasure, and humble as it is, to present my panel to you on the tough missions. I'd like to dwell on this just a moment, the tough missions. They all weren't easy, and tough doesn't actually describe accurately what tough was. It means all things to many people, many of you sitting in this room, many on this panel, myself included. But in terms of losses that our group suffered on these specific 9 missions that you will hear these men speak of, because they were there and they lived it, we have to describe them and classify them as tough missions because in summary, 1/3 of all the aircraft, the B-24s, lost, either missing in action or crashed after the mission, were lost on these 9 missions. And recall that we flew 285, so you can get the impact of how, quote, tough they were. There were 558 men who became casualties, all categories. Now, not to say they all were killed, obviously not, but many were POWs, many were escaping evaders, many were wounded, and many suffered other consequences, and some did return to fly for cocaine. Now, there were certain missions called milk runs. You've heard what a milk run is. Today, it's going to be clear on takeoff over England. We're going to see everybody. There are no fighters. There's no flak. The target's open. It's going to be visual bombing. That's a milk run, the best as I recall. And I will tell you this, a lot of milk runs turned sour. They weren't milk runs. They were tough missions. Many of them weren't just that. So without further ado, we're going to hear the accounts of these men who actually flew them. I'd like to point out one extra thing. I got to introduce them first. 48 to 50 years after the event, memories, of course, fade. We're going to attempt to scratch the surface of just what happened, what they saw. You're not going to see the tension, the stress, the anguish in many instances of dealing with an airplane out of control or seeing a buddy go down off your wing. We're not trying to make this a Hollywood production. This is the way it was. So you're not going to see these things in many instances in these men's faces. But they will address their questions quite seriously, and so I would hope that you can read between the lines of what really went on as we try to unfold each of these missions. There's a lot of data on some missions, some of the ones that were what we would call hairy, they all were, and others, of course, of a lesser significance, but nonetheless, we lost a number of crews and men. Remember, the adrenaline flowed quick and fast to men who were 19 to 22 and on who flew these airplanes. The English weather was something to contend with, and you did that before you even got off the ground. Assembling a formation of 30-some airplanes was also a task in a small area not the size of Bernalillo County, where you're having your reunion in many cases, because you had 3 air bases and 110 airplanes in there and 3 bomb groups. So I really like to address all this to make sure that put it in context. It's just not taking off from Albuquerque International Airport and just drifting over the mountains here. These men were flying in very difficult assembly, en route situations only to face the enemy. Without further ado, and I had to tell you this because this comes from my heart, and I admire every one of these gentlemen and everyone sitting out here. Now what we're going to do is address the panel. I'm going to introduce these gentlemen. And following that, we're going to go through each of the missions in a stepped order. And following that, I'm going to call on certain members of the audience who flew these missions also those, and we'll step through them again. We'll watch our time. We probably will run about 2 hours. And as I have the audience participate, I will have the gentleman come up here and take this mic and stand here so the camera will get them, and you'll have a couple of minutes. I won't wish to be rude and cut you off, but we got to keep the story right on the target. So as you hear the mission, please try to think how you may be adding something to it. Okay, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce these gentlemen. First, on my immediate right, Myron Kyleman. He's a retired colonel in the United States Air Force. He lives in Sacramento, California. He was the 579th Operations Officer to begin with, and after the fourth mission became the commanding officer of the 579th Squadron, and he was that through the war. He flew 43 combat missions. He led many missions as what they called a command pilot, that is, flying up in the lead of our 392nd. Highly revered man and certainly well respected in our ranks. The second man on my right is Cliff Peterson. Flew 18 combat missions. He presently is a retired businessman from Winter Park, Florida. He was then a first pilot of the Liberator from the 578 Squadron, and he flew 18 missions before he was shot down. He was a POW, and he flew 2 of the tough missions that we'll be talking about among, well, 3 as a matter of fact. The next gentleman is Vernon Baumgart, retired Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Air Force, lives in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. He flew 25 combat missions as a lead pilot and has some very interesting reflections on these missions. He was the first pilot, lead squadron, 579 Bomb Squadron under Myron Kyleman, and he flew so many of these tough missions. The next gentleman is Jim Busick. Jim is now a retired Lieutenant Colonel Air Force. He flew 25 missions on the Slips crew. Well, actually, Slip was the crew he was flying on this particular mission. He lives in Fargo, North Dakota. He was then a Staff Sergeant ball turret gunner. And that was when we flew the airplane with the ball turrets. You know, later they took them out when the German fighter threat was reduced. And he flew many tough ones as well. You'll hear his story. The next gentleman on his immediate right is J.D. Long. We know him very well. He flew 33 combat missions. He was a pilot with the Schildenke crew. He's also a retired businessman in Greensboro, North Carolina, and he later became check pilot and later an operations training officer in the 578 Bomb Squadron. The gentleman on his immediate right, Mr. Carroll Cheap. He's an active businessman and an entrepreneur in many major business interests. He's been, of course, as you know, most instrumental in heading up our memorial restoration project through the American Battlefield Monuments Association. Of course, is on the board. Now resides in Bel Air, Florida. He was the first pilot of a B-24 in the 578 Bomb Squadron. Next gentleman on his immediate right is J. Fred Thomas, whom we know well, 30 missions. He's a retired United Airlines pilot. He was a captain for a number of years. He served with United Airlines 36 years. Out of Huntington Beach, California, he was then a first pilot B-24 in the lead squadron of the 392nd 579th Bomb Squadron. The gentleman immediately on his right is Richard Dick Griffin, as we knew. He's a retired Air Force colonel. He lives in Escondido, California. Dick was a pilot with Bill Case's crew. In fact, I had the pleasure of flying near this crew. They didn't get too near me, I guess. But 578. And Dick later was called back into active duty and was involved in air sea rescue duties in Vietnam and retired as a colonel in 1970. Lastly, on the right, old Howard E.B. Persaud. He flew 15 combat missions. He's presently retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, Air Force. He resides in Flushing, Michigan, and he was the first pilot, first off in the 578 Squadron, and then over to the lead squadron, 579th, under Myron. Having introduced these gentlemen, we're going to get on with the symposium. Later on, we'll be hearing from Alan Duff, Randall Mayer, and others, Bill Seaton, who was a bombardier. But let's bide our time and to tell you something that was written not by any PR person of our group, but it was a piece written for the 50th anniversary of the 8th Air Force. And I'd like to read it to you. Please, I hope you can bear with me here. And this is commemorating all the bomb groups and fighters that flew. It says, our mission was to defeat the Luftwaffe and destroy Germany's capacity and will to fight. along with our valiant allies from Britain and around the world. We defeated the Axis powers. Our numbers exceeded those of any other Air Force in history, including over 350,000 devoted men and women. Our might was centered in 43 heavy bomber groups, of which the 392nd was the fourth oldest liberated group, and 4 medium bomb groups, 25 fighter groups, and 50 support groups. We flew 330,523 bomber sorties and destroyed 15,731 enemy aircraft. We had 261 fighter aces. I'm trying to set the stage of the tone and the intensity of the air combat that went over Europe. Our 8th Air Force men and women and the 2nd Air Division, of course, was the #1 division in the Liberator, in the air and on the ground, with the distinction of having over 26,000 men killed, 7,033 wounded, 28,000 prisoners of war, 1,500 detainees. I won't go on to read the medals and things that people receive from these things. However, our unit was one of the 27 presidential unit citations granted for an outstanding mission accomplishment. In closing on this comment, we remember those years with sadness because of sacrifices made and the comrades lost. We remember with nostalgia the exuberance of youth and the inspiration of fighting for rights. You can't say that anyone wasn't scared. They were. Okay, the first mission that we are going to address today has to do with a mission called Bremen, flown on November 13th, 1943. And the gentleman who will be addressing this first will be Myron Kyleman. And 1,000 men, 7,033 wounded, 28,000 prisoners of war, 1,500 detainees. I won't go on to read the medals and things that people receive from these things. However, our unit was one of the 27 presidential unit citations granted for an outstanding mission accomplishment. In closing on this comment, we remember those years with sadness because of sacrifices made and the comrades lost. We remember with nostalgia the exuberance of youth and the inspiration of fighting for rights. You can't say that anyone wasn't scared. They were. Okay, the first mission that we are going to address today has to do with a mission called Bremen, flown on November 13th, 1943. And the gentleman who will be addressing this first will be Myron Kyleman and possibly Vern Baumgart, who looked to his immediate right. This mission was the number 8 mission of the 392nd. They had suffered some pretty heavy losses before, but this mission significantly was the one where we had had 6 aircraft lost with 43 men missing in action, 3 of which were wounded and did get back. It was flown under the 2nd Air Division Field Order number 153, mission number 8, to Bremen, Germany. And we're going to go through a little scenario of questions. Myron, to you first. In this, you may or may not be able to elaborate much on any one of these, but if we can get a good cross-sectional field. I'm going to ask a question. What was the specific target reached that day, as you may recall? Were there any special target significance, like alternate targets or secondaries?
Held many great industrial complexes. So my notes state that our target was the big industrial complex of Bremen. And,
well, okay. With regard, of course, obviously that's rail yards and marshalling yards and things like that, because our strategic objectives are not bombing populous areas, but sometimes bombs went awry. Anyway, the takeoff, assembly, and initial flight en route, were there any unusual circumstances you can recall? How was the weather? Do you remember that? Or was it factor?
well, the unusual aspects of this mission, from my point of view, is that it was the first 1,000 bomber force attack on a target in Nazi Germany. It was the first time that our bomber forces had fighter cover the whole route. There were P-47s and P-48s.
I understand on this mission that you were pretty heavily attacked as we get into the actually enemy defenses by single and twin engine fighters and pretty heavy anti-aircraft opposition. Do you recall about where they picked you up? Was it coast going in or just how?
Fighters covered us from beginning to end. And it was good to see those contrails circling above us the whole route. I don't remember any fighter attacks, but I do remember the tremendous barrages and aircraft fire from the initial point on through the target area.
The Germans, of course, by that time went overrun Holland, and obviously they had a lot of front-forward fighter bases and flak installations. Did you recall anything going over around the Zuider Zee, Ostend, and on in there on this one?
No, not specific.
So you're saying really that most of the attack was probably concentrated in the immediate target area of IPN?
It was pretty cloudy day. The weather was heavy all the entire route. We had undercasts the whole route, in and out, and I'm sure that the fighter forces, the German fighter forces, were affected by the weather.
So as far as your particular ship, and you were flying an elite element of the 579th in the second section, as I recall here, according to this particular setup.
That is right. The T-92nd was leading the 14th Combat Wing with Colonel Johnson and Lieutenant Lowell's crew in the lead, and the lead of an 18-ship block, and I was the command pilot with Lieutenant Castle's crew leading the high 18-ship block.
Vern, were you on this mission?
Yes, I was.
Pull that mic up over there. Well, you can use that one. No, Claire, you can use that one in the middle.
No, I was on that one, but my recollections of anything significant just aren't there.
All right. Going down a bomb run, was it visual?
No, as I say, it was completely undercast, and the contrails were heavy. We could see the division lead's smoke bomb markers, which indicated when he dropped his bombs. And as we came abreast of those smoke bombs, which were dropped by radar, we dropped our bombs. That was normal procedure in the early days when we had only such few radar-equipped airplanes. Later, of course, when every group, wing group had their own Mickey airplanes, we didn't use it. Well, they dropped the smoke markers, but the force did not drop on just the smoke bombs.
On the bomb run, do you recall heavy enemy opposition as far as the lead thing? Of course, probably the fighters were shut down, but the enemy flak. Was that a significant factor?
Yes, as I say, there was heavy barrage, great cloud of it that we flew through. Because I don't know how our formation was hit. I don't recall. I mean, I remember being in the flak. One instance I did note, the B-17s were off to our left, probably in another part of the complex, industrial complex, and this one B-17 was hit, and it did a flip-flop. It just came up over on its back, and then it went down. It was I never saw it.
Then either come to the dramatics, you see other crews in trouble and wonder when something's going to happen and regrettable to yourself. Well, that's fine. How about on the target, after the target? Now, you said it was overcast. I presume that you didn't observe the results on the target. And we didn't have any strike force.
From there on home, it was quite normal. We kept in formation with Colonel Johnson's lead block, and formations came home with without an incident, except we lost our effort. The rear.
Well, Vern, do you have anything to add to that one at all?
Not on that mission, no.
This is, as I said, ladies and gentlemen, one of the earlier so happened as far as numbers of aircraft and men lost, the rear elements took the beat. As you look at the formation, Colonel Kyleman and Bongar here, and the people in red were to the lower left of the 578 Squadron. And whether they were hit by flak or fighters, we don't know, but the missing air crew reports that I have now, and hopefully someday we'll expand, can tell on this. But the crews, Roper, who was being flown, his crew was flown by Harris of the 576. He was lost in the lead section. A gentleman named Marfia, he was lost in the 577th right rear formation, probably a high element. And in the high squadron, high section from the 578, 4 crews were lost that day. Lama, Dudziak, Marks, and Fogarty. What the ultimate fate of these gentlemen were is why the thrust of our remembrance of the missing effort that we're trying to do in the second book is what we want to do. We put everything to rest as our history. Okay, Myron and Vern, if there's no more on that one, why we'll sort of proceed to the next set of information. And would that just about be really a long time ago? So pressing on.
What was the date of that repetition?
The Bremen mission. It was November the 13th, 1943.
Well, I think the whole thing is all messed up. Don't fight the rest of it all.
Well, sir, would you please hold until... No. I want the panel to address this, and then I want you to please keep your remarks till I ask for the audience. And I really mean this, because you can bring it all up and we can fold it into the story. I do appreciate this. I hope you understand. All right, let's go on to the Kiel mission, January the 4th, 1944. On the Kiel mission, this was mission number 22, the Kiel Canal, January the 4th, 1944. Myron flew in this particular formation as a command pilot leading the 579th. There were 27 crews briefed, and on that mission, of course, we lost 6 aircraft and 60 men. Cliff Peterson, who was on Myron's right, was also on there. So, and I hope I wasn't abusive to you, sir. I've got to have some semblance of running the darn thing. I don't mean it that way. Let's go through this again. This is Kiel Canal, long mission across Germany, or at least the Danish peninsula extending over. About this target this day, let's talk briefly about how it was briefed. Was there any secondaries, and something about the early takeoffs? Myron, I'll let you get on first, and I'm going to get Cliff here.
Well, our takeoff was quite normal. We were leading, I was just leading the group. The 44th for sure was leading the wing. And our takeoff was quite normal. Assembly was, as far as I remember, was normal. There was two blocks of what would be 18 airplanes if we were flying. That was the standard type of formation in those days. There was the undercast. There was an undercast. The whole road was dense contrails. The temperatures up at our altitude were minus 40 degrees below zero. I didn't have anything on fighters.
Cliff, okay, about getting on to the takeoff of the targets. Did you remember anything as we took off, assembly, anything on your briefing that would stand out on this, and anything about the weather?
Well, the weather is a big thing that I can remember. It's cold. It's probably one of the coldest missions I can remember. I'll go along with 40 degrees below, but I'll even add a little more to that. I believe at one time it seemed maybe mine was indicating a little higher. I thought mine went against the needle at 60 below and stopped. I had a lot of trouble actually myself, one thing, and getting back, even and freezing up. Coming back, as a matter of fact, when I landed without flaps. Took a little bit of the wire fence with me, but we didn't realize it until we'd about ready to flare out for landing. But the first part of the flaps were fine, but when they went to full flaps, they went up instead of down. So we had to land without flaps. But as far as the formation is concerned, or forming, I don't recall anything about that. However, the the fighter opposition was very heavy, and we did lose 4 crews at that day. I do have one little incident that I thought I might mention, that on that day, out of 4 crews, and in fact that most of the planes that were lost went into the North Sea. We had 32, from the missing aircrew reports, 32 killed and 18 POWs out of 4 crews, out of a total of 50 people. Maybe there was 5 crews, I believe. And we lost 30. Most of them were killed going in the North Sea. But the fighter attacks was quite heavy, and the bombing, as far as the bombing was concerned, it was they used PFF techniques because of poor visual, because of the poor target or the weather over the target, and the fighter, incidentally, the gunners claimed 13 kills on that, so you can see from that it's pretty good fighter opposition. Lieutenant, or rather, Vern was also on that mission, so he may be able to add something to that.
We're going to catch him. Myron was flying up in the lead element. Baumgart was flying right here as his deputy, and of course Cliff was buried back a little bit further in the lower left element with the 578. How about it, Vern? What do you recall in the early stage of this mission?
Well, as you all know, initially it was marked as an abort, but I think it was due to the fact I had a last-minute airplane change, because I checked my records back home and I was on the mission. But that's the one I recall.
That's what the record said, but he chewed it.
I think that was the one I recall. The temperature is so cold that prop governors were becoming inoperative on both B-17s and B-24s. And I remember it seemed like as many of them were going back as that were going that way. And I remember my free air temperature being picked at around 55 below or so. And we had icicles hanging off our oxygen masks and frost on our eyebrows. It was a dandy. That's the part I remember the best.
Speaking of something a little technical, I ask you, gentlemen, were our models of airplanes in, do they have the oil-regulated superchargers, or do we have the electronic jobs?
All of the ones I flew were oil.
So the oil could congeal and really mess up a prop governor to get it right. These early H's were that way, is that correct? Okay.
I had a lot of trouble in my airplane. It seemed like I always had at least one turbo that would run away. And we learned that if you jiggled it in co-pilot, you're pretty adept at counteracting it by playing with it. But it was annoying, to say the least.
All right, well, as Cliff mentioned, you were hit pretty heavily by fighters. That seemed to be the greatest enemy reaction. Where did it happen? Sort of along the course? Could you all elaborate on that? Let's go back to Myron. Do you recall anything specifically on that? The account says that we were hit by enemy reaction quite heavily. 50 single and twin-engine fighters intercepted the group early on. So where about when did you recall that happening? Any one of you three gentlemen? Was it in over Holland? Was it on a bomb run? Well, it wouldn't be on a bomb run, probably before the IP, or just, you recall anybody? If you don't know.
Recollection, but we have some of the crew members of the lead. I don't have a specific recollection regarding that, but crew members, Cecil Rothrock and John Colvin and who's my other buddy?
Well, those who flew the Keel mission of this day were certainly going to get your reaction, so that's not, I appreciate you bringing it up. Well, let's press on this mission. You say the bombing was PFF, or at least it was not visual. So we were encountering weather over the target. Did you notice? Did we get any strike photos of you recall on the mission as to how our bombing went?
No, it was strictly undercast. It was. I just remember a terrible buildup of clouds of all kinds, and we were just lucky to be able to see the Division League's smoke bombs to release on it.
Do you have any problems over the target or near the target with other groups wandering around, or of course other forces, other committed? The B-17s obviously were striking in and near the area, I'm sure. Was there anything in that area that you recall? It might have been another something to observe? If not, we'll press on. How about after target and en route home? Any problems? I mean, was there anything significant in that aspect of it? We lost 6 crews this day. One of them crash landed at Cromer, UK, Cromer. But before I elaborate on that a little bit, you gentlemen, I'm putting you on the spot. Anything else you may have? Total recall is impossible, we know. All right, well, the mission, of course, was also categorized as one of the heavier loss missions because, to all causes, a crew named Hall, flying out of the 579th, he was flying under Spartage. A gentleman named Waugh, W-A-U-G-H, the 578th, Lambert, the 577, Becker, Rigby, and Page, 6 crews. One crew got back to England and all got out safely. This is a very interesting aspect that I just learned through the good graces of Jim Gore. The Waugh crew crash landed in Dennis Duffield's backyard. He, for a long time, wanted to know what B-24, his father was out doing something, fishing or hunting or what, and this airplane came clipping out through the trees or whatever it was, and they went over to help the crew. And I don't know the whole story, but isn't that interesting? Many years later, our young man who sort of is steeped up in our history at Windling, Dennis Duffield, this airplane landed in their backyard virtually. Okay, well then I guess we'll just press on from the Kiel mission and go to the mission of Gotha, February the 24th. Now, I know Gotha is going to be a mission which most every man and woman has certainly heard some account of. Before I dwell on Gotha, I'd like to point out that this group was briefed according to the record for Gotha, which was the German aircraft production, which I know Myron and these other gentlemen will comment on. But we were briefed for this mission initially on the 20th of February. And it was recalled, weather bad in England, bad over the continent. Some of our airplanes got over into Holland and attempted to bomb a target of opportunity called Arnhem, but were unsuccessful, as I can read the history. And later they were recalled. However, the group did get a mission credit for the 20th February Gotha. Bringing us on now down to the mission that was flown on the February 24th, 1944. It goes down in the annals of the 8th Air Force history as one of the most accurate bombing missions ever laid on by the 392nd. Did, and they did, and they were well above average in all other categories. This mission was number 41, the Gotha of the 24th Feb. It was 2nd Air Division Field Order 213. As you know, because of the outstanding bombing of the 392nd, in correcting almost a tragic mistake made by some other groups, we got the distinguished unit citation for this mission. I'm not going to take any thunder away from the men who flew it. We're going to address primarily Myron again, who was a command pilot, Vern Baumgartner. They were up front leading this, or in the deputy lead position, flying off of McGregor. And Cliff Peterson was buried back on the 578th in the low squadron. So we're going to hear from these 3 gentlemen again, and I'll turn Myron on first here. Tell me about the early planning for the mission and, some of the early takeoff assembly, etc.
Well, the 392nd was leading the 14th Combat Wing with three blocks or squadrons of 12 airplanes each. This was a new formation that was first flown, maybe a mission or 2 before, but the size of the formation was cut down from 18 ships to 12. And this was a very much improved type of formation, which was more easily maneuvered, and air crews could fly tighter, more compact formation, and increase the degree of accuracy in our bombing. Weather was, I don't recall any problems in the assembly of the 3 blocks. The weather the whole route was clear. The weather front had gone through and left tremendous blanket of snow all over Europe. I remember how the cities and the railroads, the autobahns stood out in bold relief. I considered it made for the DR navigators, it was a no-sweat day. They could pinpoint the formation at any moment.
One thing, Myron, would you mind brief and specific, because I know you have it right on the Pacific target.
I wanted to add that with this tremendous visual weather, it also made a field day for the Luftwaffe. They were up in force, and for over an hour, they pounded us, pounded our formation, the wing formation. I'm sure they had other groups coming in too. Our group was severely hit. Our gunners were calling out fighters around the clock, and our guns were rattling the airplane regularly.
The target was, correct, the Gothier fabric work, or in German, was a twin-engine MA2 or MA210.
Well, it was a great Messerschmitt 210 works. It's a manufacturing assembly plant, and it stood out in bold relief. But before that, if we got the IP, the division and wings arrived at the IP in fine order. But the division lead, our group was flying behind second, I think, in the division, and the division leader veered from the course to the target, and this gave our command pilot, Colonel Johnson, and his crew a turn, because normally maintain strict discipline and follow the leader. But they knew that something was awry, and they must get to the target. So the decision was made, instead of following the division lead, they followed their own navigation and went right to the target. And at which time a very good visual run was made, and the bombs were dropped right on targets, and we were scored 95% of all our bombs of all these airplanes within the 2,000-foot circle. So we didn't. It was one nice thing about it. There was very little flak. I don't think I saw over a dozen bursts of flak the whole route to the target. Then, of course, we flew the assembly route after and returned home. Of course, we got fighters again on the way home, and I think our crews will tell more about that as we go on.
Sure. All right, well, we'll back off the target just a little bit. Cliff, you want to bring us up to the target and to speak to the whole spectrum of what you experienced talking to fighters, defenses, etc., etc.?
Well, I wasn't aware of the fact that the others had made the wrong turn, because I was just flying along with the rest of them. But we did turn and went into the target, and of course we had been attacked by fighters from about every imaginable kind, from the Ju-88 to the Me-110. We had they were firing rockets, and even trying some type of cable bombing. This not only occurred on the way into the target, but it occurred for a good hour after we left the target. During this time, we did lose a total of 7 airplanes from the fighter attacks. When we went in, we were flying. It was a good formation, which obviously from the fact that Colonel Kalman mentioned that we dropped 95% of the bombs within 2,000-foot circle. And one thing I remember, it's kind of a little humorous thing. I was flying, and someone had been shot down. I moved in behind the John Reed in the 578, flying in the number 4 position. And because I think number 4, who was Lieutenant George, had moved up on his left wing. And some 40 years later, or rather it was at the Tulsa reunion, I was talking to a man who was mentioning the fact that he was on John Reed's crew. Or we were discussing Gotha, I believe, and I said I was flying right behind John Reed, and we were talking yesterday or the day before about maintaining tight formation. And he mentioned, oh, you're the one. I said, I'm the one what? He said, well, you're the one. I called up to the pilot, to John Reed, and he said, is there any way you can tell that person that's flying behind me to quit sticking his nose up in my tail turret? So we were flying pretty close, keeping out of all the problems we were having. But we did maintain, we didn't lose any, I don't believe we lost any out of 578. But we did lose, like I say, we did lose 7 airplanes. The fighter, like I say, was just about as bad as any that I was on at all, except maybe one that's coming up on the Friedrichshafen raid. But the weather again was real good, and the target, the pictures taken, if you haven't seen it, of just, it's unbelievable. The picture taken before the target and the picture after the target, you can just see where there's nothing but smoke and snow around it, so you can see where it hit. That's all I can think of.
Very good. Vern, do you want to add anything to that, please?
You know, a lot of these missions I was kind of handicapped by the fact I was flying up front. I think this mission, again, I was deputy lead, so I didn't see what was going on so much in our group. But my most vivid recollection, I believe it was the 445th, was flying off to the left of us, and they were really getting their teeth kicked in. At one time, I could see 3 P-24s in various stages of descent, from the one that was starting down to the one that hit the snow. And I remember thinking, boy, that snow is deep down there. And I read later, I think it was in the Stars and Stripes, that the Germans claimed that they couldn't even get them. Many of the people had bailed out because of the depth of the snow down there. So I said I saw more of the losses of that group than I did of our own.
To reflect on this, the official account of what these men are speaking of in sort of summation, that is estimated from factual interrogations that 150 fighters in one form or another attacked the formations all along the route. Some of them were rocket-carrying Ju-88s from ME-110s to the ME-210s. And we did have some friendly fighter escort, P-47. Is that right, Myron? Somewhere. I don't know if you ever saw them or not. They were talking? I said supposedly we had P-47 Thunderbolt also trying to fight some fighter support, because that's what we were drastically lacking early on in the war is our own Allied fighters.
Just, we had fighter cover the whole trip, but they had the whole, Luftwaffe after us. But the interesting point, it was the first time the T-51s were able to cover us. And they were right there at the targets at Gotha. And I distinctly remember one diving straight from his orbit right straight down in front of our nose after a German fighter. So, of course, the T-51s became regular part of our escort force from there on.
Most of everyone knows here the daylight bombing effort of all of the group early on with General Akers' commitments and others. It was you were going in naked without fighter support pretty much. We got the Mustang, a long-legged fighter. It certainly did an awful lot against to suppress the German Air Force. That's an interesting comment. They said the P-38 was also supposed to be a covering force, but the Thunderbolt fighter was great, but it never turned out to be the greatest intermediate altitude fighter support for our bomber groups, according to even the people who flew it. I want you to know this day that Van White, I want you to know this way, the B-17s helped our group that day. There was a flying B-17 outfits were going into Schweinfurt, and they pulled off some supposed heavy attacks that we would have probably gotten under clear weather. The three bomber groups of the 2nd Air Division were up front, which Myron said looked like they were turning off in the wrong direction, were the 389th, the 445th, and the 453rd. And 453rd, of course, with Jimmy Stewart's outfit, I'm sure he wasn't up there. And the 389th fired right on in, the 392nd went right in on the brief axis of attack. Okay, well, coming off the target, coming home, do you recall anything there? I do know that a couple of these gentlemen were lost after target. I'll brief who was lost. In the 579th, a gentleman named Johns, then Patterson, and White, Schlossberg, and Barnett. And 577 was White, Schlossberg, and Barnett. 576 was Cox, and down in the 577 flying another element was Johnston. So a total of 7 airplanes were down that day, and of course we had 73 men that were casualties, missing in action, and otherwise prisoner of war, internees, etc. from that epic mission. And certainly one which is 392nd is recorded in history time after time of the tremendous job they did. And may I ask then, coming home off the target, clear weather, was there anything spectacular, unusual, or whatever would have happened there that you may recall we should possibly crank in here a little bit?
I don't remember any difficulties in returning to base.
Cliff, you?
No, nothing other than the fighters continued all the way, pretty much all the way back, even then. But not as bad as they were before the target, when we lost all our airplanes.
And we were starting to fly these new formations of 12 ships max, is that right, Myron? I know 36 people were briefed, so that would be 3 sections or 3 squadrons.
Yes, this is the first time that I recall that we flew the 12-ship formation.
Well, Gotha, you can read it in history, and it was called the Battle of Gotha, and rightfully so. But if not any other comments, we'll go on to the next category of missions, which we will cover here in this. And we'll get some comments from the audience later regarding these. Let's go to the mission which is etched tragically in many, many men's minds, because an awful lot of lives were affected by this one. And it's the Friedrichshafen mission of March 18, 1944. It was a field order, 2nd Air Division, 236, mission number 53. 29 crews were briefed for the mission, but very few got home. Again, the gentlemen immediately on my right were ones we're going to ask to cover the mission, so we want to be sure that we can try to capture the intensity of air combat going on here, because when you lose 16 airplanes and crews and some 150-some men, I mean, you know, in a space of a few moments, it's just terribly intense and stressful. Okay, Vern Baumgart, I'm going to start off with you. Now, in this particular mission, ladies and gentlemen, 579th was leading the 392nd. We were flying with a couple sections here, a lead and a low, but Baumgart, Vern was the lead pilot, with Myron as the command pilot. So Vern, how about starting off with you? Let's talk about the beginning of the missions and sort of kick it off over till we got over enemy territory. For the target area. I'd like to dwell on the target area a little bit more a little later on, so try to stop short of what happened actually in the actual target area.
Well, unlike Myron, I normally don't have the records and that, like, you know, the assembly and all the rest of it, but I know one thing that happened prior to mission probably was indicative of what could happen to us, because I had flown on mission with the 93rd Group before I was assigned to the 392nd, and the rest of my crew hadn't flown. So the 2 days before we had flown a mission to Friedrichshafen, which was ineffective, and my co-pilot had taken the rest of my crew over it. And any time that you didn't do a job on a target, you could expect the next time you came there, they were waiting for you, which they were. And so this was one of the things I say we shouldn't have been too surprised, because there's a vast difference between those two missions. So now, how far you want me?
Yes, well, let's go down to the target area. If you don't mind, sir, we'll just press on up to the actual start of the bomb run and what happened subsequently. So let's go over here to Cliff. Now, Myron and Vern were flying in the lead, and Cliff was flying in a 578, probably in a high element. And, of course, Cliff and his crew were shot down on this mission, so stop short of the actual tragic event. Cliff, and tell me what your reflections were as you pressed on from Wyoming on down here.
Well, do you mind first if I go back just a little bit?
Not at all.
The mission was brief. We had two targets actually for that day, which was Friedrichshafen and Russelheim, which is right outside of Frankfurt. They learned about 8 o'clock that our primary would be Friedrichshafen, and takeoff was not until about 10 o'clock. The forming was all right until we got just past the over the channel into France, when two of our aircraft collided just going over France, and we lost, I imagine, just about all of the members of both crews. We proceeded on to the target. There was no problems as far as any opposition was concerned at all on the way to the target. The weather was good, and we were flying at about, I think, around 19,000 feet, if I recall right. Did you want me to go?
No, I don't want to. I prefer not to go into the target area just yet. I realize you probably didn't want to go into the target area after it was all over, but I mean, let's stop short on the narration if you don't mind, Rick.
There was at least four of our aircraft that aborted, so we went in from originally 28 back to about 20, actually I think about 22 went over the target.
Myron, on the early stages of the mission, anything unusual in the planning? Other than these two gentlemen haven't covered. I don't want to go into the target just yet.
Well, it was a beautiful day. We were paralleling either the first or the second or third division of B-17s all the way in. They went on to Regensburg or the lake, where we turned right at just east of Lake Constance and into Friedrichshafen. But there was it's the first time that I got to really fly with the B-17s, and they don't fly any better formation than we do. and besides that, they have tail-end Charlies, and I saw one poor old tail-end Charlie get shot down right in front of my eyes, and with fighters, but the fighters didn't hit us. And then there was the 8th Air Force had established a special unit with B-17s equipped with super armor all over the airplanes, and of course I'm sure the people, the gunners and all were armored too. And there was a formation of 6 of these B-17s flying good formation, and they were just kind of moving back and forth, passing back and forth. I thought, well, that's kind of funny. And I didn't realize that until later that they had developed or had tried out this form of formation with special airplanes to attract fighter attack. Anyway, the fighters still hit their forces. We had good fighter cover. The contrails above us were orbiting just beautifully. And then we turned into the target.
And we'd like to hold right there for a moment, sir. Does anybody recall any other specifics about the two crews that collided, I guess over France, you said, Cliff? We had 2 aircraft come together, Anderson and Dalton's crew of the 577th had a tragic mid-air collision. Presumably, I've read by what accounts that Anderson got into prop wash and drifted back, and Dalton cut the tail off of his airplane.
The one thing that probably prevented many from seeing it, because actually if you hold up the formation there, you'll see that they were the very last 2 airplanes. So the other part of the formation were probably not too aware or were able to see just what happened.
Well, we're going to pin this down, and I think the MIA showed that Macker, that Anderson's crew all perished, and some of Dalton's, including himself, I believe got out of the airplane. Well, all right, now we're going plane going down, and you did have fighter escort. What type of fighters were briefed for you? You recall? 38s or something like that? Well,
they were pretty encircling up there. I didn't.
well, he mentioned they had fighter escorts, but apparently their timing being late caused a lot of havoc.
Oh, well, this is on the way in.
Yes, going in, you know. All right, well, now we're at the IP. The weather was great. Did you have any flack or much affecting you going in up to the IP? Cliff?
The flak that I recall did not occur until we were into the bomb run, and then it became very intense. I think maybe Colonel Kalman could explain a little more about the fact that the 44th that was ahead of us was forced to make a 360-degree turn, and of course that left us not only the formation a little bit confused, but also left us well behind, which will come up later, of any type of being able to avoid any fighter opposition. Maybe the reason, and maybe you saw it better than I did, Colonel Kalman, on what forced 44th to make that 360.
Well, as I know that the group cut in ahead of them, they cut them out, forced them out of position to do the 360. It wind up behind us. But the flak, we were flying right along the north shore of Lake Constance, and they had the batteries, their anti-aircraft batteries positioned all along there, and it was just accurate and intense. It's not only visual, but they no doubt had their radar working very good. And every shell, every that went off, that burst, was right in our formation. And before I knew it, we were hit. The flak was, of course, clattering all over the airplane, and then once the airplane seemed to stop, and of course Byrne, being on the gauges and flying the bomb run, recognized the problem immediately and feathered number 4. But here we slowed down from our regular speed of 160 to about 150, and with that the formation pushed ahead of us, and I looked around with the idea of boarding the lead, and I checked my deputy lead,
Who was Everhart?
and he was on 3 engines. So it didn't make any difference.
And on your left at this time was Brooks' crew. Now, what did they been hit too? Brooks was flying on number 3.
Well, yeah, of course I didn't keep track of. I couldn't keep track of who all was hit the bomb run or the like. So we did the best we could.
Let's see what Byrne can add up there.
That is, doing the best we could to salvage the bomb run. And we did get some bombs in the target area. And then we made our turn out and took stock of our losses and regrouped. And we turned towards home, and I could just barely see the group ahead of us, just little specks in the sky. So we were sitting out there all by ourselves. And of course the 44th was behind us, but that's a really pretty small force out there, all clear to Lake Constance. And then, sure enough, our fighters, our gunners called the fighters, and we could observe them climbing up on our right, up our right wing, and climbing up just like the book and the movie 12 O'Clock High depicted, right up into the sun, and then peeled off, and the whole force, I don't know how they did it, I mean, how they do it. There was a whole gag of airplanes together, and they came right into us, and with their guns blazing. And both, so when they went through us, our planes we were hit pretty bad, and we'll get into all that later. But they drove through us. Then they came on around and did the same thing, climbed up into the sun and peeled off right into us with their guns blazing, and did some more damage to us, and some more of us went down, and here they come again. Third time climbing up. And I was sitting there, the only thing I could do was call for fighters. I was calling them on the frequency, the fighter frequency, to try to give them an idea where we were and troubles we were having. And sure, and thank goodness, 2 P-38s came in high above this third, this force of fighters coming in on us, so the third time, and dove in behind them, and the Germans just scattered like a flock of pigeons, and saved us, some of us anyhow, and then we didn't have suffer any fire attacks that I was aware of until I got to the Rhine River, and then we had some Ju-88s come up to the rear and shoot at us. But Cliff probably's got a better story than that. Our airplane, one of the planes in the second element had trouble, and our bombardier, I probably should let Vern tell.
All right, well, I'll get Vern. I appreciate it, Myron, what you said. Speaking of the bomb run and what happened, I'm going to let Vern, being the lead pilot here in the same airplane with Myron, what's your recollections of that IP to target immediately thereafter?
I was being lead pilot. I was at the debriefing later at Shipton, which was the 44th Home Base, and they mentioned how they were forced out on the run, and as we mentioned, there's a gap ahead of us and behind us. Incidentally, the 44th that same day also lost 8 airplanes. So between us and the 44th, we lost half of the total 8th Air Force losses that day. We lost, I guess, 22 airplanes, and the total 8th Air Force, I think we lost 43. But anyway, after the flak had torn us up, Spartage was flying the slot behind me, and he said later they were after me, he said, because he was flying through smoke all the way across the target. And when we got that airplane on the ground, looks like somebody had gone crazy with a hatchet. But remember, the engine that quit wasn't actually hurt. It was the throttle control. The flag had knocked out the throttle control, and the engine went into full idle. That's all we knew later. 12 inches of manifold pressure doesn't do much good for you up there. And as he said, I remember to this day I can see those fighters coming along to the right side, and when they came in 5 abreast. I don't remember ever seeing that before. They were literally wingtip to wingtip, 5 of them at a time, straight on in. And every time they came in, I mean, somebody got it. And the plane I think Myron started to allude to is Muldoon, as some of you know. And I looked down, and of course, there again, I was out front. I couldn't see what was happening behind me, but Muldoon's airplane was right alongside of the big hole about that big around, and a bulletproof window right behind, alongside the co-pilot's head. And I figured he must be headless by that time. There was bomb bay doors were open yet. A parachute was flapping in the bomb bays. The plane looked like it was in bad shape. Actually, a 20 millimeter, I found out later, had gone in at an angle through the glass right behind the co-pilot's head, exploded in the radio compartment, set the radio operator's parachute on fire. They tried to throw the parachute out, and it caught in the bomb bay, shorted out the alarm bell, and the radio operator, or the bombardier and navigator both bailed out. The rest of the crew, they looked, they said all 4 engines are going, they were going to stay with it. And those guys got back to England. And of course, we got a hole in, I think it was my left wing. It was supposed to be self-sealing tanks, but they don't seal a 20 millimeter hole, and all the gas was running off the trailing edge of the wing into my back waist area. My co-pilot, since Myron was flying as command pilot, my co-pilot was flying as waist gunner back there, and he was standing knee-deep in 50 caliber shell casings by this time, and he tried to get the attention of my tail gunner, and I couldn't contact him, so but he was alerted. He had his doors open, so in case something happened, he could get out, and he tossed his shell, hit him in the back, and the tail gunner looked around, like this. He held up his cord for his headset. It was severed. Then he reached down, he held up his heated suit cord. That was severed. Went over, got out of the turret, held up the elevator cables on the right side of the airplane. They were severed. Like Myron says in the story, good thing we had a dual set. And he got one cut in the heel of his shoe, just scratched him a little bit. And our navigator, I was cruising along, all of a sudden he looks back at me out of the Astrodome, and he went like this, and his whole face was full of blood. He'd been looking at the little blister, and something hit it about that time. It shattered right in his face. And he later lost one eye. They were able to save one. And then he and the bombardier was flopping around in the nose. My bombardier, who was never trained on the Sperry site, was a glorified nose gunner. He called up. He was a little excited about this time. He says, the bombardier is trying to throw the navigator out. What he was actually doing, the navigator was in shock, and he was trying to bail out without his parachute, and the bombardier is trying to stop him. Next thing he says, the whole nose is full of blood. Well, it was his hydraulic fluid, which is red in color. He could see some of it splattered up on Myron's boots there, and I guess he thought maybe that's all was left of Myron was his boots. It was a little bit hectic for a while. They could probably leave it go there. They could probably have a little more.
Well, you can imagine there was no levity in the cockpit when this was happening. I don't know why in the world they ever made hydraulic fluid red, but we know. Well, that's incredible. And of course, the whole left side of your formation was pretty well wiped out, as you later saw. Books on your left wing, and then Sharp behind him, Johnson and Muldoon you mentioned, and Bruce Suey in the 578. But at the target area, there's a gentleman who, if he hadn't been as big as he is, I don't think he'd have manhandled his B-24, but this is probably one of the most interesting stories, too, I've ever heard. Cliff was flying in the 578 section off of Verne and Myron, leading an element. And of course, Cliff was shot down, and two men blasted off his wing. So Cliff, over to you in the target area and meet thereafter, and what happened?
In the target area, as Colonel Collins said, the formation was a little bit mixed up, and when they lost their engines, things got a little bit hard to stay in good formation. As a matter of fact, the second block of our group, which was led by Lieutenant Clover, had to get away and did not bomb the main target, but bombed an alternate target, I believe the railroad yards at Stockash, I believe is the name of the town. We continued on, and these little specks that Colonel Collins saw before were still specks, but they were fighters at that time coming in, and probably anywhere from 80 to 100, I would say, total. Maybe it is exaggerating it a bit, but they would come in like it was said, about 5 or 6 abreast, and come right through the formation. I think it was Raschke, who was flying in my right wing, went down on the first pass. I moved over into another position, and they went around, came back in through again. Other airplanes were going down, and I managed to miss the second time. But the third time they came through, and as much as what we had left of our formation, at least, they came through, and the next thing I knew, the cockpit was pretty much exploded. The whole side of the co-pilot side was blown out. The glass was blown out, and we, at that time, actually lost complete control of the airplane. But just prior to this, maybe a few seconds, as this plane came over, whether he was intentional or whether he had lost control or what it was, but he was so close that I could actually see his face in the split second of rate of closure, and right over my right wing. And within maybe 5 seconds of that time is when we lost complete control. We went into a spin, and There was a report by one of the planes that was still there that this airplane took the tail end of my airplane off. I don't know that, of course, never will. But the fact that I lost all gunners in the back of the airplane could very well be true, that that plane may have taken the tail end of my airplane off. But we went into a spin at about the altitude of about 19,000 feet. We could see we had no control. We rang the alarm bell. The navigator apparently got out as soon as we rang the alarm bell. But then I turned around and the top turret gunner was hanging down from his turret. I thought he'd been hit. But to this day, and I get a letter from him about every week, I think we say he just goes frightened. He just fainted from shock or something. But he was the only one that actually didn't get a scratch. And we got him down, and then we tried to get out. Well, we couldn't get out of the bomb bay, couldn't get the bomb bay doors open, and we were in a spin, and it was pretty hard to move or do anything else in the airplane at that time. I got back up in the seat again. I can remember doing that. You kind of forget now, and you don't really realize what things did happen. But I got back in the seat to see if I could correct the airplane. But then we found out we couldn't get the bomb bay doors open to get out. And but it was impossible because all you could see was the spinning of the airplane. You could see the snow and the sky and then the ground and going around. So I decided better get back out too. And shortly after that, somehow or another, whatever the miracle is, I don't know, when we were able to get out, we bailed out, the four of us on the flight deck, the radio operator, the top turret gunner, engineer, and the co-pilot myself, and jumped out. I jumped out. It was real quiet for a second, and then, of course, the next thing I heard was another loud noise. I looked up, and there was the airplane going down right probably 100, 200 feet from where I was in the air, and it hit the ground probably 10 or 15 seconds before I did. Maybe landed at maybe 200 yards from where I hit the ground. I would imagine that we were in the air, probably in the parachute, probably maybe as much as a minute, but probably not anymore. We hit the ground, and from then on it was nothing to do with. I guess you're interested in.
Thank you very much. Do you call anything on the Books crew? I realize they got back part way and went down. We're going to hear from a gentleman here who visited the crash scene of this and other cruise. You know anything about the Books crew, if you can recall?
No, personally I don't. He was flying off Colonel Commons' Vern's left wing, and I moved over into that formation after the first time through. However, I couldn't say exactly where it was. I didn't see anything about him, but I think if any of you don't already know about him, you certainly probably will hear, because Jim Marsteller has done more work on finding information than we have in 40 years. And so I'm sure that we'll get to hear from him, and he probably knows more about that.
If you can just notice the red and the opposed black, you can see what the Luftwaffe, except for the two crews who collided, did to the formation in a matter of about a running battle of maybe 20, 25 minutes. They had a field day. And to recap the mission, of course, 16 airplanes, 2 of which crash landed on the way back, including Muldoon and Havermill. And the other gentlemen were most all prisoners of war killed in action. 154 men. Anything else that we should add to this? I know we could talk a number of days on this one. Coming home, you say after you left the Rhine, you're pretty well shot up and crippled, just hoping to get to England. Anything else that came that you might want to talk about?
Well, other than the fact that after the fire attacks, we were taking stock of the situation. The gas was just, as Burton was saying, the gas was just pouring out of our left wing, and of course some of it into the waste windows and just drenched those gunners. A little bit. So I called the engineer down from the toilet and asked him to get the gasoline valves adjusted to use as much fuel out of those tanks as we can. And so he was working on that. And pretty soon the gasoline stopped flowing. So for those who don't know, are wondering, whether self-sealing gas tanks work. They do. We did save some fuel, and then the question came, well, it wasn't at that moment. We're struggling along, and then I learned today, it wasn't, in my story, I say the tail gunner called the pilot to pull up. Pull up, he said. And it turned out to be the bombardier. Another airplane came up dangerously low below us, like it was going to strike our airplane, and he called Baumgart to pull up, and he did. So we left, actually boarded the lead at that moment, and so then after that emergency, we tacked on to the high right element as a lead of the high right element, and came on home. But then the JU, just about crossing the line, here comes some JU-88s to shoot at us. Luckily, they didn't hit us, but here these explosive shells off our right wing, and then here they'd be off the left wing, and sure enough, they hit us. We wouldn't be here today. And then, but we got back to, we followed through the formation on home, around to England, and then, wait a minute. You want to talk about going to Switzerland, Vern?
Well, it was our 25th and last mission, so obviously I'm an aeronautics navigator. How far was to Switzerland, which way my crew wasn't in favor of that at all, because getting back to England to us is like getting home to the States. So we were not in favor of going to Switzerland if we could in any way avoid it, which we were fortunate to get back.
I'd like to add a comment on that, and this has to be another chapter. Walt Hebron and his crew, of course, were hit so badly that they made an emergency landing in Switzerland, and of course were ultimately interred there. And he's got an interesting story. We won't be able to cover it today. I don't know whether Walt's with us or any of his crew. And Haffermill's crew, at least Haffermill didn't. He got out, he bailed out, and his co-pilot landed his airplane. We don't know the circumstances of that, but his crew was in the middle of Switzerland interned. So their stories will come out at a later time. There might have been another one, and I don't have the data on that, but there were 29 crews briefed for this mission. When they got home, about 11 of them got there, and that's quite a reflection on the intensity of what they went through. Basically, 392nd Flying Good formations, I recall. Obviously, it wasn't because of that. They were ganged up on by fighters that didn't have any fighter opposition as far as our protection. We had a hole in the formation, in the division line, and the Luftwaffe just jumped it. Would that be a way to summarize the effect of what happened to Friedrichshafen? Anything else you got before we take a little break here? No, we're okay on time.
There were two killed, actually, on a plane that landed back in England. Lieutenant Tiefenthal had two people killed on his plane. And then in addition, there was 8 others that were slightly wounded from other crews. I won't give their name, but there were 8 others that were injured when they returned to England, and crews that did return.
Okay, we're going to hear a little bit more about Friedrichshafen, a little bit more from some crew members out here. Of course, Mr. Jim Marsteller, who went back to one of the crash sites of his uncle. I'd like to take a break. We knew this was going to last 2 hours, 2 hours and 15 minutes. Before we finish the other 4 or 5 missions, it's now 3:17. Let's take a 7-minute break and get back here, if you will, at 3:25. All right, gentlemen? Thank you.
Early in the morning when the engines start to roar, you can see the old goat standing in the operations door. He'll be sweating out the takeoff as he always has before. Safe behind his armor-plated desk, take 'em off, take 'em off, take 'em off. You can hear him in the briefing as he stands back in the rear. Though the runway's sucked in solid, still the target may be clear.